The county maintenance yard on the south edge of Caldwell wasn't the kind of place people visited unless they had business there. A chain-link fence, a gravel lot, 2 rusted equipment sheds, and a row of surplus items tagged for disposal. Most of it was the usual cast-offs: cracked culvert sections, bent signposts, a road grader with a seized hydraulic arm. But stacked along the far fence, half buried in mud and last year's weeds, were 12 floodgates, old ones. The county had pulled them from ditch and culvert outlets along Sycamore Creek the previous autumn, and now they were waiting for someone to haul them away for scrap. On a Tuesday morning in late March, Elsie Mercer drove her pickup through that gate and parked in front of the shed. She was 66 years old, and she farmed 600 acres of creek-bottom ground 2 miles east of town. Corn, soybeans, some winter wheat on the higher ground. She had been farming that land since her late husband Gerald bought it in 1974, and she had farmed it alone since 1991. She was not a woman who wasted a trip. Marty Hobbs came out from the shed wiping his hands on a rag. Marty ran the drainage district surplus yard and had seen plenty of unusual buyers, but Elsie Mercer walking toward that stack of old floodgates gave him pause. "Morning, Elsie. Something I can help you with." She was already crouching beside the nearest gate, turning a hinge arm with her thumb. "These the gates from the Sycamore outlets?" "Yes, ma'am. Pulled last fall. Engineers condemned the lot of them. Hinges seized, seals cracked through. Couple of the frames are warped so bad the flap won't seat. We can't use them on any approved structure." He paused. "We're taking whatever we get for scrap." Elsie stood up and looked down the row. 12 gates in varying conditions, some worse than others. The yellow county paint was chipped and faded. One gate had a hinge arm bent nearly 45 degrees. Another had a rubber seal so cracked it had split into separate pieces lying in the mud beneath the frame like shed snakeskin. A third had a frame warped along the bottom rail so severely that the flap sat a full inch off the seat on the left side. No engineer in the state would approve it for a public drainage structure. "What are you asking?" Marty told her the price. It was low, the weight of the steel minus hauling, essentially. He watched her walk the length of the row, stopping at each gate, checking hinge movement, pressing a thumb against seal edges, measuring frame widths with her hands. She spent the most time on the ones that looked worst, studying the hinge arms and the flap faces with the same attention she gave the better ones. "They're not going to hold against anything serious," he said. "County engineer wouldn't approve them for a private drainage structure either, if anybody checked. The frame, warping alone, I understand what they are." She came back to the first gate and looked at it one more time. Then she turned to Marty. "Load every gate." Marty wrote the ticket without further argument. He had learned over the years that when Elsie Mercer finished making up her mind, the conversation was already over. Ray Holloway was refueling his pickup at the co-op when he heard about it. Frank Delaney mentioned it at the counter, said Elsie Mercer had driven off with 12 condemned county floodgates on a flatbed and paid scrap price for the whole pile. Ray set down his coffee cup. "Broken ones from the maintenance yard?" "Every last one." Marty said she checked every hinge before she bought them. "Man said she was down there 45 minutes. Frank shook his head. "Warped frames, seized hinges, some of them barely open." Ray farmed 380 acres, most of it downstream from Elsie's ground on the west side of Sycamore Creek. He was a practical man, not a gossip, but this struck him as the kind of thing that deserved an explanation and he couldn't think of one that made much sense. "She planning to stop the creek with those?" he said. It wasn't entirely a joke. Nobody at the counter had a better answer. Mara Mercer was 33 and had been helping run the farm's field records, chemical timing, and crop scouting for 4 years. She was organized, careful, and not easily flustered. But when she pulled into the farmyard that afternoon and saw the flatbed backed up to the machine shed with 12 rusted floodgates stacked on it, she stood beside her truck for a long moment before going inside. Elsie was at the kitchen table with a legal pad and a county drainage map spread flat under her coffee cup. "Mom, afternoon, those the county gates? They are." Mara sat down across from her. "They look like they came out of a creek bed." Some of them did. Elsie made a note on the pad. Mara looked at the map, then at her mother. "What are they for?" Elsie didn't answer right away. She found a measurement on the map, wrote it down, and circled something near the lower field. Then she looked up. "We'll start with the south outlet on the sycamore field, then the tile outlet on the lower east corner op." "Start what?" "Putting them in." Mara waited, but no further explanation came. She looked at the map again, at the creek line, at the drainage ditch markings running through the low fields along the east side of the farm. She thought about the ditches they had cleaned 2 autumns ago, scraped and pulled and opened up so water would move fast in a wet spring. "The ditches are clean," she said. "We did them in October." Elsie nodded. "So, what's the problem?" Elsie looked at the map again. "Come out to the field with me tomorrow morning. I want to show you something." Clay Barnes had retired from the county drainage district 7 years earlier after 31 years, running culvert crews and ditch machinery along every creek bottom in the county. He was 68, walked with a slight lean from a hip that had given him trouble for a decade, and kept a welding rig in his garage that he used for neighbor jobs and his own amusement. He was not easily impressed, and when Elsie called him and described what she'd bought, his first response was a long silence. "Marty's gates?" "Yes, Elsie. Some of those hinges are seized solid, and if the frame's warped past a certain point, the flap won't seat well enough to do anything useful." "I know. That's why I want you to look at them." He came over on a Thursday. He walked the row of gates slowly, checking each one the same way Elsie had: hinge movement, frame alignment, seal condition, flap swing. He sorted them without being asked into 3 groups. 6 he set aside as workable with repair. 3 he judged marginal, usable with significant effort, possible but not certain. 3 he placed by themselves at the end of the row and shook his head. "These 3 are done as gates. Frame on this one is beyond what I can pull back. The flap on that one has a stress crack through the hinge casting. The third one, the seal's completely gone and the frame's twisted on 2 axes. There's no mounting that makes them reliable." Elsie looked at the 3 rejects carefully. "What can you get off them?" He turned back to the pile. "Hinge arms on 2 of them are still good. Plenty of bolts. Flat steel on the frames. This one's got seal backing material that's actually intact behind the cracked rubber. You could strip it and use it as backing for the others." Elsie nodded. "Then we strip them." The 3 gates Clay had rejected never became gates again. But over the following 2 weeks, their hinge arms replaced bent ones on 2 of the working gates. Their bolts was into the mounting hardware. Their flat steel was cut into reinforcement plates for warped frames, and the seal backing material gave Clay enough to finish the rubber seal work on the last 2 outlets. The 3 broken gates that couldn't close an outlet by themselves helped repair the 9 that could. "The 9 I'm confident in," Clay said. "On a farm outlet, properly mounted, they'll move water out when the field drains and close when pressure comes the wrong way. They won't be pretty, I don't need pretty. I need them to close when pressure comes from the creek side." He looked at her steadily. "How many outlets are you thinking?" "5 on the sycamore field, 2 on the east corner, 1 on the north side ditch." He thought about that. "That's ambitious. Is it possible?" He rubbed the back of his neck and looked at the sorted gates again. "We'd need to cut some new hinge pins. I've got flat rubber stock that'll work for seals, if we cut it right. Mounting will be the real work. You'll need to anchor them so they swing out clean and seat against the outlet when pressure reverses." He paused. "Who's going to dig?" "I'll get Mara on the excavator." Clay picked up a gate panel and tested the flap with both hands, feeling for the hinge resistance. "This one's got maybe 80% of what it needs. On a farm outlet, that might be enough." "Undoubtedly might is what I've got," Elsie said. The Sycamore Creek bottom field was 140 acres of some of the best soil on the farm. Dark, heavy clay loam that grew corn like the ground wanted to push it up. It also sat lower than the surrounding land, and the main drainage ditch that cut through its center ran south, then west, then discharged into Sycamore Creek through a concrete culvert and an old steel outlet pipe. That outlet was roughly at creek level during normal flow. In a wet spring, the relationship between that outlet and the creek's surface was the thing that determined whether the field drained or didn't. Elsie walked Mara to the outlet that morning. The creek was running clear and low, a dry March so far, though the long-range forecast was already drawing attention at the co-op. She pointed to the outlet pipe, which extended horizontally from the ditch bank into a small concrete head wall above the creek edge. "What do you see?" she said. Mara looked at the pipe, the head wall, the creek. "Outlet pipe. Water's moving through it fine. Water's going which way?" "Out. From the field toward the creek, right." Elsie crouched and picked up a small stick. She held it near the outlet end of the pipe. They watched it drift slowly out with the trickle of field drainage. "Now," she stood. "What happens when the creek comes up above this pipe?" Mara looked at where the pipe terminated, then at the creek surface. In normal conditions, there was 1.5 feet of clearance, maybe 2. The pipe backs up, more than backs up. The pressure reverses. Creek water tries to move back through the outlet, into the ditch, and from the ditch into the field. It doesn't care which way the pipe was meant to work. Mara was quiet for a moment. She looked at the field behind her, 140 flat, low-lying acres, with a drainage ditch running through the middle, all that clean-scraped ditch leading straight back to this outlet. Then she looked at the creek. "The ditch carries it in, fast," Elsie said. "A clean ditch moves water in both directions just the same." They stood there while that settled. In the distance, a tractor was running somewhere beyond the tree line. The creek moved along unhurried. Nothing about the scene looked urgent. "The gates go on the outlets," Mara said. "On the ones that matter, but they're broken." Elsie started walking back toward the truck. Some of them were. They worked for 3 weeks. Clay welded, cut hinge pins, bolted reinforcement plates to warped frames, and trimmed flat rubber stock into seal strips that he and Mara pressed into the gate grooves and fastened with stainless screws. Mara ran the excavator to open the ditch banks near each outlet, so they could set the gate frames into the concrete head walls and bolt them properly. The finished installations looked exactly like what they were: repaired salvage, patched and field-mounted. Nothing that would appear in a drainage engineering catalog. The rubber seals were mismatched widths. 2 frames had visible weld patches. One gate swung with a slight drag from a hinge that hadn't fully freed, but each gate, opened outward with field drainage pressure, swung smoothly when Mara pushed it from the field side and closed and seated against the outlet frame when Clay pushed from the creek side. Ray Holloway drove by on a field check one afternoon and slowed when he saw Mara and Clay working at the south outlet. He rolled down his window and looked at the gate bolted to the concrete head wall. Rust-streaked, patched, the old county paint still faintly visible. That one of those scrap gates she bought from Marty? Mara said it was. He nodded slowly, not unkindly. What's it supposed to do? Keep backflow out of the outlet. He looked at it another moment. The creek was low and calm behind the tree line. The sky was clear. Looks like a lot of trouble for low water, he said, and drove on. He wasn't wrong. Nothing about that April afternoon suggested urgency. The fields were drying from a light spring rain the week before. Planting windows were coming. The creek had barely crested its banks in years. The light rain 2 weeks later was the first real signal, though most people didn't read it as one. It came in overnight, just under 2 inches across the county, which was enough to raise the creek, but not enough to concern anyone. By morning, the fields were wet and the ditches were running. Elsie was out before 6, walking the south ditch bank toward the Sycamore outlet. Mara found her there 20 minutes later. The gate was doing exactly what it was designed to do. Field water was moving down the ditch and pushing the flap outward, draining normally into the creek. But the creek had risen overnight to within 8 inches of the outlet pipe. As they watched, the flap swung out, drained a pulse of ditch water, and then, with the creek pushing gently back, closed and held for 30 seconds before the next pulse of field drainage pushed it open again. Mara crouched down and looked at the mud on the creekside face of the gate. There was a faint wet line where creek water had pushed up against the flap, not through it, against it. It tried to come back, she said. Creek's not high enough yet to force it. Elsie looked at the outlet. But that's what it'll do. The ditch drained, the flap cycled, and the gate held. The field stayed wet from the night's rain, not flooded, draining steadily through the morning. By afternoon, it was running clear. Mara walked back with her mother and said nothing for a while. She was turning something over, not quite seeing it all the way through yet, but close. The creek had pushed against that flap. The ditch had almost moved the wrong way, and if it had, the same channel that cleared the field after a normal rain would have carried creek water back into it. What happens when the creek's above the outlet, not just near it? The gate closes and stays closed, and the field gets wet from what falls on it, but it doesn't get the creek on top of that. She still didn't fully feel the weight of the difference. 2 inches of rain on a flat clay loam field was manageable. The ditches handled it. They always had. What she had not yet seen was what happened when those same ditches were carrying creek water instead of field water. The forecast shifted in the second week of May. A slow-moving low-pressure system stalled over the region and delivered rainfall in stages over 5 days. Nearly 6 inches across the creek watershed above Caldwell, falling on ground that was already saturated from a wet April. By the 4th day, the National Weather Service had issued a flood watch for Sycamore Creek and most of its tributaries. By the 5th day, the watch became a warning. The drainage district's phone rang steadily through the 4th night. 2 culvert outlets on the county road south of town were already submerged. A debris jam upstream had slowed the creek's channel and pushed water into a low pasture. By morning, every crew the district had was assigned somewhere, and the calls kept coming. Multiple farms along the watershed were reporting water where it shouldn't be, ditches running the wrong direction, outlets buried under creek backwater, tile lines that had drained fine 2 days earlier now holding water or pushing it the wrong way. Crews were clearing debris, pulling equipment to high ground, and trying to assess which outlets needed attention first. But the creek was above every outlet along the lower reach of the sycamore by mid-morning, and there was no practical way to put a crew at every farm that was calling. Elsie checked county drainage map that morning and made 2 phone calls, one to Clay, one to Mara. Then she put on her boots and drove to the field. The creek was moving fast and brown, carrying topsoil and debris, already lapping the edge of the grassy strip above the bank. The outlet pipe was under water. The gate was closed. She walked the full length of the south ditch bank, checking each outlet she and Clay had worked on. Every gate was closed. The ditches still held water from the last rain, running but not draining. They had nowhere to drain to, because the creek was now above every outlet on the field. The field itself was wet, with standing water in the low corners where the clay wouldn't absorb anymore. Young corn stood in 2 to 3 inches of water in the worst spots, leaves pale and stressed. One gate near the east corner had a thin line of seepage along the bottom seal edge where the creek pressure had found a gap. Debris, silt, grass stems, small sticks pushed by the creek had accumulated on the creekside face of 3 gate flaps, pressed there by the backflow pressure and held. But the ditch lines were not carrying creek water inward. The gates were seated against the outlet frames, and the creek was pushing against the flap faces, and the flaps were holding back the worst of it. It was not a clean or comfortable scene. Mud pulled at her boots with every step, but the water on that field had fallen from the sky. It had not come up through the ditches. 3 miles west, Ray Holloway's soybean field told a different story. He had planted his creek-bottom ground the previous week, a good planting window, soil temperatures rising, a clean field with his drainage ditches scraped and open all the way to his outlet on the creek's west side. He had felt good about it going into the rain event. By the second day of the storm, he noticed the water in his main ditch was not moving toward the outlet. It was moving away from it, back toward the field. He stood at the ditch bank in the rain and watched it for a full minute before he understood what he was seeing. The creek had risen above his outlet. The outlet was now submerged, and the creek pressure was pushing back through it, filling his clean-scraped ditch, and the ditch was carrying that creek water inland across his low soybean ground. The very thing that had made his field drain fast in normal conditions, an open, clean ditch with good capacity, was now moving water the wrong way at speed. By the time the rain stopped, the low third of his soybean field had 18 inches of standing water over newly emerged plants. The rest had 6 to 8 inches. Crop roots that had been in the ground less than 10 days were submerged, and the water was not leaving, because the creek was still above the outlet, and the ditch was still connected to it. He wasn't the only one. Half a mile north, Dennis Albrecht had a cornfield with a tile outlet on the east ditch. When the creek rose above that tile end, the same pressure reversal moved water back through the tile line and pushed it up through the soil in the lowest rows of the field. Dennis had spent 2 days trying to keep a pump ahead of it. But the pump was pulling water out of the field while the tile was carrying creek water back in. He couldn't pump fast enough to outrun a pressurized tile outlet with the creek behind it. By the time he pulled the pump and accepted the loss, the low corner of that cornfield had sat underwater long enough that replanting was already being discussed. Across the road from Elsie's north boundary, a wheat field belonging to a retired farmer who cash rented his ground had a drainage ditch that reversed on the third day of the rain event. The renter noticed it only when he checked the field and found the ditch running the wrong direction, carrying silty creek water into the crop. The wheat in the low section was still standing, but it had been submerged long enough that the heads would not fill properly. A quarter of that field would come up short at harvest. The county drainage crews reached Ray's outlet on the 5th day. By then, the creek had already begun to drop, and the damage was done. Clay Barnes checked the gates on Sill's sycamore field the morning after the creek peaked. He walked each one carefully, the way he had when they first sorted them in the farmyard. He noted hinge movement, looked at debris accumulation on the creekside face of each flap, checked seal edges for compression marks. At the south outlet, the main one, the one that drained the largest area of the field, he crouched and examined the rubber seal strip along the bottom edge of the gate frame. It had compressed unevenly. One corner showed a faint wet mark where water had worked through. He stood up and looked at the field. Still muddy. Low spots still held water. Young corn was yellowed in the wet areas but upright, leaf tissue intact. One seal leaked a little, he told Elsie. Corner on the south gate. I'll reset it this week. I saw it. He walked the ditch bank toward the outlet, looking at the debris line on the inside face of the bank. Creek material, silt, grass fragments, small sticks, had pushed up against the gate flap and been held there. The debris told the whole story. The creek had driven hard against those gates, and the gates had closed and seeded and slowed most of it. He turned around. Behind him, the field stretched back to the north, wet and muddy, but the corn rows were visible. The plants were stressed, but they were standing. You didn't stop the creek, he said. You stopped it from coming in through the field's own door. Elsie was looking at the outlet. That was the part I needed. Mara was standing a few feet back. She had heard it. She looked at the gate, rust-streaked, patch-welded, the seal edge still wet from 5 days of creek pressure, and then she looked at the ditch running back through the field, clean scraped, wide, moving water fast in both directions. She thought about Dennis Albrecht's tile outlet. She thought about Ray's ditch running the wrong way while he stood there watching it. She thought about how a field could sit behind a good clean drainage system and still drown because nobody had thought about what the ditch would carry when the creek decided to push back. Her mother had not been watching how high the creek would get. She had been watching where the water would go when it did. Mara didn't say that out loud. She just stood there looking at the outlet for another moment, and then she walked back toward the truck. Ray came by on a Thursday, a week after the water had gone down enough to walk the fields. He pulled up to the fence line where Elsie's south field met the county road and got out of his truck. Elsie was checking row spacing in the near section, counting plants. He leaned on the fence post and looked at her field, then at his own low ground to the west where a neighbor's custom crew was running a pump trying to pull water off the worst of the drowned area. A replanting decision was still being discussed for the south third of his soybean field. He looked at the gate on Elsie's south outlet. Visible from the road, ugly and patched against the concrete head wall. "Your ditch is backed up," he said. "No." Elsie kept counting plant spacing. Gates stayed closed. He was quiet for a moment. Mine ran backwards. I didn't think about it until I was standing there watching the ditch move the wrong way. He paused. "Didn't think a cleaned ditch could do that. Ditch that saves a field in April can drown it in May," Elsie said. She wasn't unkind about it. She said it the way she might say rain was coming, a fact that had been true long before either of them was farming. Ray looked at the gate again. "Who put those on for you?" "Clay Barnes. We used 9 of the 12. The other 3 we stripped for parts." He nodded slowly. He was a practical man, and he had a decision to make before next spring about his own outlets, and he was already beginning to make it. He didn't say anything else. He just said he'd better get back and check on his pump, and he drove west. The field work that followed was ordinary and hard. Elsie and Mara spent 2 weeks clearing debris from gate frames, pulling silt from the ditch banks, and resetting the leaking seal that Clay had flagged. One gate needed reseating entirely. The frame had shifted slightly under pressure, and the flap was dragging on one side. Clay came back and fixed it in an afternoon with a hydraulic jack and 2 new anchor bolts. Some of the corn in the low spots was lost. The yellowed plants in the worst wet areas didn't recover fully. There would be a yield drag on those acres. Elsie noted it in her record book without drama. Wet area, south low corner, estimated yield loss, planned tile extension for next fall. She did not calculate what the gates had saved against what the rain had taken. That wasn't the kind of accounting she kept. What she knew was that the field could be harvested. The roots had survived because the water that covered them was rain, not creek, and rain eventually soaks in or evaporates. Creek water, pushed in through an open outlet and held there by a flooded ditch, does not leave until the creek drops, and by then, for many crops, the damage is already done. Water does not care which way the ditch was supposed to work. Elsie had understood that for a long time. Now the spring had proven it again on fields that had trusted their clean ditches right up until the creek changed the direction of everything. 3 weeks later, a second, smaller flood watch came through. The forecast showed 2 days of rain over an already wet watershed, enough to push the creek up, but not to the levels of the May event. Mara was at the farm when the watch posted. She pulled on her boots without being asked, walked to the truck, and drove to the south field alone. She went to the outlet first. She checked the gate flap, hinge movement, seal edge, debris caught against the frame from the last event. She pressed the flap from the field side and felt it swing clean. She looked at the creek, then at the outlet elevation, then at the gate again. Then she walked the ditch bank north, checking each outlet in sequence. At the east corner tile outlet, she found a weed stem caught in the hinge arm and pulled it clear. At the north ditch outlet, she noted the seal edge. On the right side was beginning to show compression wear, and wrote it in her notebook. Only when she had checked all 8 outlets did she walk to the creek bank and look at the water level normal. Running clear, plenty of clearance below the outlet elevations. She drove back to the farmhouse, washed her hands, and sat down at the kitchen table where the county drainage map was still folded open from the week before. A drain is only a drain when the water is moving the right direction. She hadn't heard her mother say that exactly. She had watched her prove it. The 9 repaired gates stayed on those outlets through 2 more growing seasons. Clay reseated one frame in the fall and replaced the rubber seal on the south gate the following spring. Elsie kept a box of cut rubber seal stock in the machine shed, marked with a piece of tape that said what it was for. She didn't talk about the purchase much. When people asked, and a few did, after that May flood, she told them what the gates did in plain terms, without pride. Some of them drove out and looked at the outlets. A couple asked Clay for help on their own farms the following summer. The 9 gates still had their county paint marks when they went into the ground. They were never pretty. They were never meant to be ski scores for more rural stories about forgotten farm wisdom that still works when it matters. By the next flood watch, Mara checked the outlet before she checked the creek.